Picture yourself in early 2003. 9/11 was just over a year ago, and the United States is invading Iraq for oil, thus starting a meme that would stand the test of time. I know what you're thinking. No, we aren't testing memes, nor we're melting steel beams with jet fuel. Those are different videos for different days. And if I really wanted to feel the full brunt of the US government, I could just start a religious cult and invite the ATF over to take my guns with force. But I digress. The United States of America was the only superpower in the world at the time, and instead of diverting its resources to humanitarian efforts domestically and or abroad, it had other ideas. Among these ideas, such as the second Iraq invasion, as mentioned before, it came up with hypervelocity rod bundles, or as everyone would soon call it, rods from God. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the developing country you happen to ask, this project never got past words on paper. It was deemed too expensive and inaccurate. However, that was 2003. I feel they didn't try hard enough, or they were limited by the technologies of their time. Regardless, this is a DAE, or Draw and Experiment, and I am going to try and fix rods from God. Roll the intro. Hey there, YouTubers! Now, before we get into math and hypotheticals, let's talk about what hypervelocity rod bundles are and their origins. The idea the Air Force proposed was simple and elegant. Large tungsten rods would be put into orbit around the Earth. These large rods would be 1 foot or about 30 centimeters in diameter and have a length of about 20 feet or just over 6 meters. Their mass would be about 9 tons or 8.2 metric tons. And finally, Wikipedia wasn't very specific with the speed. It said its orbital speed about Mach 8 and Mach 10 as the potential impact speed. However, I question all of these because Wiki said it would lose speed as it travels through the atmosphere. Mach 10 is faster than Mach 8, so unless it's going faster than Mach 10 in transit to its target, these numbers make no sense. Luckily, we were given an impact energy of 48 gigajoules or 11.5 tons of TNT for equivalent power. Which means if we solve the kinetic energy equation in reverse, we can find the rod's final velocity. Now, before I show you the kinetic energy equation, we need to know what Mach is. Mach, in simple terms, is a representation of local speed of sound. I say local because the speed of sound is determined on many factors. A few include the gas or fluid you're traveling through and its temperature. Notice I didn't say a solid. Sound can travel through a solid, but you cannot. Basically, Mach 1 can be a variety of numbers, but for today, I'm going to assign it 767 miles per hour, or 1,235 kilometers per hour, which is a rough average for Earth's atmosphere. Great, with that out of the way, the kinetic energy equation is as follows. Ke is equal to 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared. So let's solve the equation backwards to find our velocity of our rods. First, let's do some unit cleaning. 48 gigajoules is equal to 48 billion joules. 9 US tons is equal to 8,164.66 kilograms. And our velocity for Mach will be in meters per second, yielding 343. Don't worry, I'll convert these to normal units at the end. So our equation looks like 48 billion is equal to 1/2 times 8,146.66 times v squared. V is representing our final velocity or speed of the rods. First, we'll multiply our mass by 1/2 to get 4,073.33. Then we'll divide 48 billion by the product we just got to yield 11,783,970.36, which we will find the square root of to get 3,432.78 meters per second. So in freedom units, that is 7,678.9 miles per hour, or 12,358 kilometers per hour. To find our Mach equivalent, we'll divide the freedom units version by 767 to get, drumroll please, roughly Mach 10. I'm going to leave this in, but I was reading the wiki page sometime after writing the previous 2 paragraphs, and I read it very, very wrong. It gave way more information than I originally thought. So, impact speed will be Mach 8.8, and orbital velocity will be Mach 24, not Mach 8. It doesn't give an impact energy for Mach 8.8, only Mach 10, which is interesting. But the math is still cool, and it gives you a perspective of how the US military would have found the impact energy from the mass and a velocity. Now let's get back to the rest of the video. Great, we verified the numbers, and these things are scarier than I originally imagined. It seems that at some point they're traveling at about Mach 24 or faster, which means they get to enter the high hypersonic speed range, or if they're going faster than Mach 25, orbital reentry speeds, which makes a lot of sense, and I'm happy for them. Before I get into the origins, let's explore some more information about the project. The Air Force said to get adequate coverage of the Earth, there would need to be 6 to 8 satellites in low Earth orbit filled with these rods. Now, if you know anything about satellites, you know they're kind of like sitting ducks that move at Mach 24. Not easy to hit, but not impossible, as their orbits are predictable and calculable. Thank you, Newton and Kepler. Where would it be without you two? Anyway, the government recognized this and said hit-to-kill missiles or a megawatt-class chemical laser would do the trick of protecting the rods. These would be accompanied by a spectrum of sensors meant for detecting anti-ballistic missile-type threats. Now, I should note that chemical lasers are a product of their time, i.e. in 2010, the United States military dropped all funding for chemical lasers in exchange for diode lasers. They stated that chemical lasers required a supply chain of chemicals to continue to operate. This was deemed inefficient and, quote, renewable power sources, end quote, were to be focused on. Basically, electricity should be used instead of chemicals for powering future laser defense systems. Keep this in mind for later in the video, as this changes the power requirements for my satellites and makes the engineering more challenging, to say the least. So where does an idea like this come from? Well, the original idea started in the 1950s and was created by Jerry Pournelle. And back then it was called Project Thor, a way cooler name if you ask me. Jerry later became a science fiction writer, a place where this kind of thing makes more sense. However, using kinetic energy to kill people wasn't a new idea, but Jerry was the first to put this idea in space. Kinetic bombardment, as these types of weapons are called, has its roots in World War I. In World War I, planes would drop metal darts into trenches. However, if the wind was just right, they would miss. Later versions of this technology would be used by the United States in Korea and Vietnam with limited success. Now that we have some history, let's cycle back to the 2003 proposal. As you can see, whatever you're sending these rods at has the potential to have a large amount of energy imparted into it very quickly. These energies are equivalent to small tactical nuclear weapons. Now that's pretty small as nukes go, which are usually in the kilo to megaton range of power. However, let's say you want to take a target out in a country halfway across the world, and you don't want to put your people in harm's way and drones are too vulnerable. Then you would want to use an ICBM or intercontinental ballistic missile. However, this will take a half hour to reach its target and is easy to detect its launch. Our tungsten rod, by comparison, could be there in 15 minutes, and until it hits the atmosphere, you don't know when or where it launched. It seems, according to the Air Force, at this point, it's too late to stop it. This is why it was attractive, quick, precise, and basically impossible to stop. Now, precise is a stretch. The Air Force said it was very difficult to aim. If it missed its target, even by not very much, the target will still be there. Compared to a tactical nuke, who, if it missed, its energy is spread over a wider area. The target could still be destroyed. Unless it's a bunker, which was a major use case for the rods. They could be an excellent bunker buster. However, the Air Force ran the numbers, and bombs of the same physical size designed for bunkers could do the same amount of damage as the rods. Alright, before I get into my solutions, let's make a pros and cons list. Pros. They can be anywhere on the planet in 15 minutes. They are virtually undetectable. Even if you do detect them, they are virtually unstoppable. They will have a very large impact energy without any conventional munitions. Finally, they would be free to operate once in space. Cons. They need to be in space. They need to be made out of very dense and heat-resistant materials. The satellites that hold them will be easily tracked. However, defending them is relatively easy. They will be very expensive to manufacture. The materials needed to produce them will be very expensive. Putting them in space will be very expensive. Without chemical lasers, powering diode lasers will be a challenge. They can easily miss their target. And finally, all of their energy is directed downwards, not radially. So the rest of this video is trying to fix these cons and determine if they are still worth it. Oh boy. We'll break these cons down into 3 categories: cost, power/tracking/defense, and target termination. Let's start with cost. As a man with a degree in economics, this is where I thrive. Now, if we look at rods from God in the perspective of the Air Force in 2003, putting stuff in space was not cheap. Actually, if we look at this graph I found, it costs a minimum of $6,000 to put 1 kilogram into low Earth orbit, or LEO. Of course, for something like this, we'd want to use a fairly powerful rocket. I was too lazy to find what the actual most powerful rocket in 2003 was, but I'm going to assume it was the space shuttle. Based on this graph, it costs a lot of money to operate. The shuttle could only deliver, in the best scenario, 29 metric tons to LEO, meaning that it could only deliver 3 rods at a time. Not to mention the rods will need deorbiting assemblies, of which I don't know the masses for, and therefore could reduce the number of rods to 2 per launch. I also don't know how many rods each satellite would contain, but I can only assume it would be more than 2 to 3. Not to mention the mass of said satellite containing the rods is unknown. But that was 2003, over 20 years ago. This graph tells us the cost of getting things into orbit has drastically fallen. However, unless we fully expend Falcon Heavies, we are still going to need a lot of launches. A Falcon Heavy in fully reusable mode can only deliver 20 metric tons to LEO, and in fully expendable mode, 50 tons, which is an improvement, but in fully expended mode, this defeats the cost of savings we could have gained. However, in the coming years, Starship could make this project annoyingly easy. It is suspected that its LEO capabilities could be 150 metric tons. So if each of our satellites contains 10 rods, that's only 82 metric tons of rods. That leaves us with 68 metric tons of satellites and deorbiting assemblies, i.e., we will probably only need 6 to 8 launches to complete the project. SpaceX is also claiming some incredibly cheap prices for each of these launches in the future. I think I heard at some point, don't quote me on this, but the cost for one launch would only be $1 million. If this comes true, it kind of breaks the rest of this video. I had a whole idea about mining the resources for these rods in space, thus limiting the number of launches and costs. I wanted to change the name of the project to Project Goldenrods, because gold is more abundant in the solar system than tungsten, which is in stark contrast to the Earth's crust, where tungsten is far more abundant than gold. It is also easier to mine gold and work with it due to its significantly lower melting point and being a softer metal. Gold also doesn't like to bond to things, so it will be mined in its metallic state. However, in space, most metals are found in their metallic state. It's only safe to assume that tungsten would be the same way. Also, iridium and osmium are more abundant and denser than tungsten. And actually, if you combine the abundances of iridium and osmium and use an alloy of the two, that's more abundant than gold in the solar system. However, they too have high melting points and are very hard metals, so they would have the same manufacturing issues as tungsten. Gold would melt as it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, but I figured an ablative heat shield is a small price to pay for a cheaper end product. Like I said, though, there's not really a point to mine for the resources in space if launching stuff from Earth would be very cheap. Not to mention the logistics of space mines would be their own issues. This isn't to say that asteroid mining is a bad idea. In fact, it's a great idea. It prevents us from having to destroy natural habitats on Earth and could reduce the cost of certain materials due to their larger abundances in space. It is possible that a gold mining operation in space could cause the price of gold and any currencies attached to its value to crash. However, but I suspect that would be short-lived. As the price falls, the demand will increase. As the demand increases, so will the price. The price will stabilize, but it is possible the new price will be lower than the original. However, this will only happen after the Goldenrod project is completed. There's a lot more I could talk about with the mining logistics, but considering what we've learned, that feels pointless. Moving on, let's talk about the satellite itself, or power/tracking/defense. So to limit people's ability to track our satellites, I suggest we design them like stealth aircraft. A continuous curve, radar-absorbing coatings, which coincidentally also absorb visible light, more on that later, no right angles, and an internal weapons bay are just a few characteristics. However, if this satellite absorbs all of these electromagnetic waves, this makes it a black body approximation. Thus, this energy will be radiated as heat, which could be detected on the ground and defeat its stealth. Now, if the black body approximation thing confuses you, I suggest you look it up on Wiki, link in the description to my other sources as well, but it gets into thermodynamics, which has caused a lot of people to hurt themselves because it's very complicated. So, if you want, you can go do it. You've just been warned. However, some radiator panels on the side not facing the Earth should solve that problem, provided we can limit its radar cross-section at the same time. However, this is all null and void if we can't power the dang thing. Now I can hear you asking, Doc, how much power can reactor control wheels, a computer, our sensor array, and a radio transmitter/receiver consume? Not very much, nothing a few large solar panels couldn't handle. But remember how the US government stopped funding chemical lasers? I do. Well, I don't know of any other way of saying it, but chemical lasers were perfect for this application. The chemicals needed to power the lasers could be stored for long periods of time and were very energy dense. Now, the missiles I mentioned earlier are still an option. However, if the enemy launches more projectiles than we have missiles, our satellites are sitting ducks. So we need to figure out how to make diode lasers work, which means we need to have large amounts of power available at any given moment, which means there are 4 available options to us. Solar power, a nuclear fission reactor, a nuclear fusion reactor, and a surprise 4th option. Solar is a bad option. The amount of panels needed to power the laser would defeat the purpose of trying to make the satellite stealthy. Fission is probably the most realistic option, but comes with 2 issues. One is that the satellite, if it's deorbited unexpectedly, you'll have radioactive debris falling from the sky, which could be a double-edged sword for your enemy, but moving on. The second is the fuel will constantly be degrading even when it's not in use. Basically, you'll have some fuel in the core at all time running the station, and spare rods outside the core for later power demand. When the laser is needed, the spare rods are dropped into the core to increase power. The rods outside the core are degrading at a slower rate than the ones in use, but they will still need to be replaced at some point. Fusion would be perfect for this application, if it existed yet. The reactor can easily be throttled like a car. Increase the fuel feed rate and your power output goes up. Now, the fuel in today's world would be very expensive, especially if we used helium-3 or tritium as some examples. However, helium-3 is very abundant in lunar regolith, so if we're mining in space, the fuel could be pretty cheap. However, either of these fuels have short half-lives and are small atoms, thus long-term storage is impossible without regular refueling, which would need to be done anyway because the reactor would be in constant use and would need refueling and upkeep. What is my surprise 4th option? Stick with me here. The internal combustion engine, when combined with a base power provided by solar panels, is actually a pretty decent idea. Let me explain. As a source of longer-term energy storage, high energy density, and quick energy generation, it's not half bad. Now, fusion and fission will beat it any day of the week, but in today's world, it's a cheap option. Your issues won't be fuel like with those others, as long as you use diesel or kerosene and not hydrogen. Your problem will be the need for an oxidizer, or liquid oxygen in this case, which will boil off over time. Like I said though, our solar panels will be providing base power, providing the power for the computers and the other electronics, and keeping the oxygen cool. However, you're still going to experience some boil off, so this will need to be refilled, but liquid oxygen isn't that expensive. The engine will only run when the laser is needed. Of course, this is all hypothetical, because you may need comically large engines to power these lasers. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk target termination. The biggest problem the Air Force saw with the project, excluding price, was a lack of accuracy of the rods. Now, from what I understand, this is just my observation, I could be wrong. Once the rods were in the atmosphere, they would only have passive stability, meaning they would have fletching like an arrow, but no active stabilization. The biggest reason that I could see from the Air Force was that active stabilization, that system would burn up upon re-entry. However, and maybe I'm being too simplistic, but I feel like we could protect the system long enough for it to reach its target. The majority of the rod will still be made of gold or tungsten, but the fletching will always need to be made of tungsten. That's just what's going to have to happen. The electronics could then be encased in tungsten as well, with a layer of space shuttle-like tiles and insulation for a good measure. One small issue, compared to guided missiles, the rods can't see where they're going, because any cameras you put on the outside will be burned up because these things are going Mach 24. So, they will only be able to be guided by GPS and GPS alone. No internal telemetry. However, this presents its own issues, as the rod will be enclosed in plasma, which will act as a Faraday cage. If you don't know what that means, plasma is a conductor like copper. It can conduct electricity. If you encase an area in copper or another conductor like plasma, the area inside of the conductors is a dead zone. No electromagnetic waves like GPS signals can get there. This is a problem if we're trying to use GPS to track it. However, I'm hoping at the back of the rod where there's less plasma, there'd be a big enough gap that if we concentrate a signal, we could sneak through. If this is possible, we could then use additional ground stations to provide more telemetry. But again, this is an active war zone, and these rods are going to go deep into enemy territory, which means we're going to need our tracking stations on the front lines, which seems kind of reckless and dangerous. Lastly, these rods are really only good for bunker busting, as I mentioned earlier. The energy they impart into their target is one directional, not spread out. This gives it limited use cases, as the Air Force pointed out. And there are better weapons for busting bunkers, as the Air Force said. So the challenge to myself is to see if I can spread the damage out. My cousin Phil suggested that the rods, just before impact, open up to reveal more rods and or spheres. I feel that rods are just a bit too complicated, because you have to rotate them and add the additional horizontal velocity to them and do those aerodynamic forces. If they're not being rotated, it just got too complicated. Spheres aren't a half bad idea, no rotation needed, so we could just use some conventional explosives to give them enough horizontal velocity just before impact to spread out your energy. Of course, our rods and spheres would need to be made entirely of tungsten or tungsten plated gold. This would add additional cost and complexity to this already stupidly complex and costly weapon. However, I had another devious idea. Evil laugh. This idea is so ridiculous. It's almost on par with the internal combustion engine. Hear me out. What if we mined some uranium from asteroids in the vicinity of our gold asteroids, right? Then we enrich said uranium to weapons grade. That means we're going to remove a bunch of uranium-238 and increase the concentration of uranium-235, allowing us to have a much better fissionable product. May I remind you that the UN will not like this, but we're far enough away from Earth that the prying eyes of the UN can't see what's going on. We then shape the uranium into 2 cylinders. One cylinder will have an open space in it so that another cylinder can fit perfectly within it. These cylinders are loaded into our rods with a gap between the two. The smaller one is placed on a rail system to ensure that it can slide into the larger one. A mechanical stop is put in place so that the smaller cylinder can't move until it is time. The rod is sealed up and placed in orbit. When the rod is released from orbit, upon impact, the force will break the mechanical stop, allowing the cylinders to collide. This will happen so fast that a nuclear chain reaction will take place and a very large amount of energy will be released. Now, if you want to get a bigger bang, you can just add a small tank of lithium deuteride. This won't be an air burst, so it will be dirty, but it will still do more damage than the rod alone. Much more damage. The real question is, will the UN be able to tell the difference between a conventional rod and a uranium-enriched rod? And does this violate the Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits weapons of mass destruction from being in orbit? I argue it does not, because it can't go off like a conventional nuke. However, as I say that out loud, it sounds stupid. But I'm not a lawyer. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Side note here, if we did put nuclear material in the tip of one of these rods, it ensures mutually assured destruction, which means that we wouldn't want to use the rods, and therefore all this money and funding and time would be virtually worthless. That's not the first time it's happened, but I kind of want to see these rods get used, so no nukes is probably better. This video was longer and more thorough than I originally thought it would be. That's what she said. It makes sense, though. If I want to outdo the most powerful military in the world, the video needed to be that way. I was hoping by this point in the video I could say, yeah, my plan would work, and then it should be done. However, the idea is still ahead of its time. Most of the technologies to make it work don't exist yet. Sadly, even if they did, it seems that it's still too expensive, even for the United States. And that's saying something. But what do you guys think? Is a golden rod constructed in space with a nuke in the tip of it worth it? In the meantime, I would like to thank you all for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. New videos end of each month, or whenever I feel like it. Shorts every day, noon, Central Time, and good night. Subs for trees, subs for trees, subs for trees, subs for trees. Oh, you're still here? I thought I told you to go home. Oh, you want more? I'm flattered. Check out the playlist. If you want exclusive content, check out my Instagram, Dr_sheep_YouTube. That's all lowercase. If you want to help the earth, subscribe. When I reach 100 subscribers, I'm going to plant 10 trees. If you feel that's too small, then check out my channel chart where I lay out even bigger goals. Finally, stick around for the next 20 seconds to give me that sweet watch time. Bye.